Going beyond the headlines. Asking the questions you want answered. Exploring government policies and how they impact you. We are delving deeper.
Good evening and welcome to Delving Deeper. I'm your host, Kimberly D'Souza. This evening, we're going to be discussing the proposed increases for electricity rates. And so joining us are the chairman of the Regulated Industries Commission, Mrs. Dawn Callendar, and the executive director of the RIC, Mr. Glenn Can. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you.
To your viewers as well.
Now, Mrs. Callendar, I'll start with you first. Of course, we know the hot topic right now, of course, is the proposed electricity rate increase. But before we get to that, though, what is the role of the RIC?
Well, thank you very much for that question because, somewhere in the consultations, I believe that may have been lost. So the role of the RIC is that we are the economic regulator for utility providers. We regulate not only TNTech, we regulate WASA, we also regulate 2 of the generating companies that supply electricity to TNTech. Our role is quite broad. So for example, we are doing the increases now, and in that regard, that falls under one of the sections of the Act. We are required to do that every 5 years. In addition to that role, we look after our consumers. We ensure that the rates that are proposed for them, that those rates are affordable, and also that they obtain a certain level of service, a certain standard of service. With respect to the service providers, we want to ensure that they are efficient in terms of their operations and that they have the level of financing that would allow them to carry out their programs. We have another stakeholder that we recognize. We recognize the government of Trinidad and Tobago because, of course, as we've said, the government provides a lot of the subsidies and incentives. And as well, sometimes the government has a broader goal, for example, around conservation. So that's the role that we play, balancing all of these stakeholders.
Yeah. Now, I understand that the RIC would have had a host of consultations across the country as it relates to those proposed increases. I also understand that the consultation process ended on March 31st. Share with us some of the feedback that you would have gotten thus far.
Right, so we got both written feedback and we had actually advertised that we will take written feedback up to March 31st. We also had a lot of interactive consultations with special interest groups and also the general ones that focused on the public. We did a consultation actually up to the 31st of March, so we did one up to the very last day. So the feedback we've gotten, I think, is pretty well known in some instances. Concerns about the level of the price increases. We also had feedback. We had a number of persons citing whether the consultations were real, so to speak, or whether it was just window dressing. With respect to the written feedback, those were a bit more detailed. And they covered a wide spectrum. So for example, we had some persons saying, well, you should increase the electricity rates because we need to think about the gas consumption and what that means for the entire country. We've also had persons who have been absolutely against it and said it's a very bad time, it's coming after COVID. We acknowledge those things as well. And as I've said, we are very lucky in terms of the Commission of not having the discretion to make that kind of determination. Because I think if a commission had that kind of authority, it could be really put to mischief. So we didn't have that discretion. We were required to do it every 5 years, and once we got all the information, we proceeded.
Mr. Khan, I'm going to bring you in here. I mean, what is the next step?
Well, next from the 31st of March to now, there is an ongoing process of interrogating all of the responses that we receive, written and verbal. What we are doing is that we are examining them to determine if any of the comments and issues raised are deserving of action by the RIC. Some might just be people's views that we don't have to act on, but in other cases there might be some concrete proposal that we have to examine whether this is workable. So we're in the process of, like I said, examining all of these things, and at the end of that, we will produce something known as a final determination, which will include any considerations that we have given to issues raised during the consultation period. And once that final determination is issued to TNTEC, they will then use the internal processes to determine when the rates will become effective.
Mr. Khan, when is that document expected to be completed?
Yes, so initially in the consultations, we were saying to the public that we should be finished by the end of April. But because of the large written comments that we received and the fact that we need to examine them thoroughly, we have decided that we probably go to 2 weeks in May before we come out with that.
Yeah. And Mrs. Callendar, I'm coming to you because beside that current rate review, what is next for the RIC?
I think the consultations really reveal to us the lack of knowledge about the RIC and the work we do. I think it's very important for us at this stage to begin in a proactive way to engage with the national community, to talk a little bit more about the role of the RIC, the work we do, the necessity for that work. And in fact, programs such as this one, these programs are important for us to spread that message and to educate the public.
Let me ask about the meeting that took place in Central a few weeks ago. First of all, walk us through what would have led to the abrupt ending of that meeting, and how did that impact on the other consultations that took place?
Although it seemed, well, let's say that that meeting ended before the time that we had planned to end it. And usually what we do is that we would sit and we take all the questions of persons in the line. And there were a number of persons still in the line when I brought the meeting to an end. Sitting at the head table and looking at the entire room, one has a certain vantage point. And what I saw happening in the room and the fact that, various events seemed to have been happening spontaneously and we had no idea where it would go next, that was why I ended that meeting. So the disruptions we had a gentleman who came with a loudspeaker, and that was the first interruption we had. He proceeded to play music through his loudspeaker. The same gentleman then went to the mic with 2 loaded flambeaus, and he actually said that he was thinking of lighting them, And at that stage, I became very cautious and very wary because there were a number of persons in that room. And if, for example, he had proceeded with that act, then we could have had a very different situation. After he had been quelled a bit, we saw someone coming with a coffin, dragging it through the auditorium. And I began to question, what would happen next, because we had no idea. I had no idea what were the next steps that were planned. I really thought it was particularly insensitive because the persons who came to the consultation, they had been raising concerns about COVID and we know we had a large number of deaths during the COVID pandemic there. And to bring a coffin, which could be emotive, it could trigger persons, in unfortunate ways. I thought that was quite lacking in sensitivity, and as I said, I had no idea where we would be going next. I noticed also that the persons who seemed to have a lot of influence in the room, they were not moving at any stage to stop that kind of action. And therefore, I thought that I should stop it.
Yeah. And how did that impact the other consultations moving forward? For example, did you hear people maybe not wanting to attend any in the future for at risk of being exposed to that kind of thing that would have happened at that particular meeting?
Yes, well, we were very fortunate, I think, in putting out a press release giving assurances of the kind of security measures we would take. And the subsequent consultations were actually very well attended and with the proper, I would say, the proper sort of reaction from the persons who attended, meaning that they ask their questions, and they are hard questions sometimes. We have no objection to the hard questions, but we were concerned about the misbehavior.
Yeah. Now, Mr. Khan, the proposed rate increases, it could be as much as 64%, of course, depending on the consumer consumption. And so how did the RIC come up with these figures, and why now?
Well, the percentage increases really have to do, as you say, with the level of consumption. But process of rate setting really has to do with covering the costs that the customers impose on TNTEC's system. So the first thing that we try to do is to match the revenue generated from consumers with the cost to provide them with those services. You see? So that is how it is done. And when you do that, then you have to consider things like affordability. So if, for instance, we know that we need to recover 2,000, I'm just using a small number, from 10 people, right? Mm-hmm. That's the first step. We need to get $2,000. But how do we apportion that 2,000 among 10 people? So if we say 5 people use the bulk of the electricity and the other 5 use a little bit, we look at that and we determine how much the 5 that use a little bit will pay and how much the 5 that use a lot will pay. Now I use very small numbers just to make it simple. But that's essentially what we are doing. We're looking at the number of customers in each segment because we have 4 tiers. So how many customers are in tier 1? Mm-hmm. How many in tier 2, in tier 3, and tier 4? So the ones in tier 1, those are considered to be persons on pensions, low incomes, and so on. And we gave special consideration to them. Right. So the increases to the people in the tier 1 would have been the smallest. And as you go up the line to tier 4, where the consumption levels are higher, then the percentage increases tend to be greater because those people are better able to afford a higher price electricity than the persons in the lower tier.
Yeah. And Mr. Khan, I'm asking why now? And I'm asking that question because I know Mrs. Callendar would have mentioned, of course, the fact that we're coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Mm-hmm. And based on the tier system that you mentioned, for example, a supermarket might be in the higher tier. And so if we do that increase to them, mm-hmm. then, you know, what sort of impact we're expecting to have? But first of all, tell me why now? And then let's talk about the impact as well.
Right. So why now? The chairman indicated that we have no discretion as to when we undertake this exercise. It should be done in 5-year cycles. But the thing that has to be done before we conduct the exercise is to receive a business plan. And prior to this period that we received this current business plan, we had not been able to get all the data and information required to undertake this analysis. Now, this analysis is a very involved analysis. Mm-hmm. It requires expenditure on operations as well as capital. And this must be done and produced as a forecast over a 5-year period. So it's a lot of work to do that. In fact, the document is close to 500 pages that we received. And then we have to analyze that. So we had no data and information prior to 2021, which we could use to conduct the analysis. So it wasn't a question of why now. We only just received the data and information, and we can only now progress on doing the exercise, right?
Mr. Khan, allow me to veer off a little bit,
sure.
The impact that such a rate increase can have.
So let me answer the issue about, you talk about tiers, and right? So the tiers don't relate to business. That is in the residential class. The businesses there are 3 customer classes: residentials, commercials, and industrials. The businesses, their rates are different to residential rates, and there are different considerations that go into that. Okay? So in one case, we have two commercial categories, B1 and B2. The B2s, their increase is only 10 or 11%. So not in all cases the increase is very high, right? But as I told you, it is the cost to serve customers that really makes the increase different. You know, it can't be similar for everybody because everybody doesn't impose the same considerations to the TNTEC, right? So your question was what? Remind me.
The impact.
Yeah. So we analyzed the impact. So in the case of residentials, one of the things that we look at is household expenditure. Mm-hmm. And the last available data from the CSO was 2009. Now that gives an average of household income at around $7,000. That doesn't mean that everybody gets $7,000, but average household income is $7,000. Now, if somebody says, oh, well, people get $3,000, even if we use that figure, the average consumption by residentials in Trinidad and Tobago, so any residential home, the average consumption for a month is around 625 kilowatt hours. And for that level of consumption, the proposed rate is $263. Okay? Now, 625 consumption, if you're using that and using 263, and somebody is getting $3,000 a month, 263 is less than 10% of 3,000. And the international benchmark that is used is that no household should spend more than 10% of their income on electricity. So if we're using the international benchmark and we use the average consumption, people who are getting 3,000 not paying up to 10% of their income for electricity, but the average income, as I told you, is 7,000. So it accommodates a wide spectrum of people, from 3,000 to 7,000. And you are only going to be paying, with the proposed rates, $263 for the average consumption of $625. So on that basis, we didn't think that the impact would severely or inconvenience anyone in any way, because we thought that was affordable.
Yeah. And just a follow-up question quickly, Mr. Khan, with that example that you used, is this $263 going to be paid per month or
Yes,
over?
per month, yes.
Good.
But like I said, that is for 625 kilowatt hours.
With
now,
that particular example.
Yeah. As your consumption moves,
yes,
that changes. Or if it goes down, that changes as well.
Yeah. How will these increases impact on the customers who currently receive a rebate from the utility company?
Well, I don't know if you recall that the rebate is given to persons whose bill bi-monthly is less than 300, right? So I don't know what the government would do in relation to adjusting their position with that, because we are moving to monthly bills, and that was for a bi-monthly bill. So I have no idea what will be done. But it is public information that the government said they're going to introduce a utility card. And that is supposed to be more targeted to persons who are in need. Right? At the RIC, we think that's a good idea, but we don't know how it's going to work.
Now, Mrs. Callendar, I know you must have heard the feedback coming from the business community in terms of the rate increases being too high. What message do you have for this particular group?
So, yes, we had those messages from them, and in fact, a lot of those messages came in what we call the special interest group sessions. Those sessions had been held behind closed doors because we wanted persons to feel more comfortable in terms of bringing their data points and so on and sharing it with us. We were quite sympathetic to what they've said, and in those discussions, you know, there was the possibility of phasing the increase. And I will talk a little bit more about phasing so that we're a bit clearer. So I would say, let's say over 5 years, you wanted to collect $100 from someone, and the person says, well, can you phase it for me? Maybe you will end up with a number that's higher than 100, but you're going to phase it over time because, of course, we know about the time value of money, we know about inflation and so on. So if it's phased, it is quite possible that the end total might be a bit of a higher number, but it could bring in the increases more gradually. And that is something that we are very open to considering, and we are going to do the evaluation on that.
Mr. Khan, is there a chance that the RIC will revise the figures from the December 30th last year?
No, I don't know. We don't want to be telling tales out of school. What we'll say is that we are giving serious consideration to all of the concerns that have been raised, and when we are finished, we are going to have a press conference which will make this known publicly.
So just to be clear, it's the government and TNTech who agree on the rate increases?
No. The RIC's board has the full authority to approve the rates. When that is done, it would be sent to, that would be the final determination, which is then sent to TNTech. As TNTech is a state entity and reports to a minister, then that is where their discussions will take place on what they will do in terms of the implementation. I want to make the point that the rates set by the RIC are maximum rates for 2023. The maximum, it means that TNTech can't charge anything above those. It may charge below those, but it can't charge above those. This is why I said when we do the final determination, it goes to TNTech and they hold discussions with their shareholder, which is the government. They can decide when they're going to implement and what they're going to implement, but not anything higher than what the RIC board has set.
Now, Mr. Khan, after the rates have been set, is there a specific time limit for TNTech to implement?
So currently there is no time limit. I should just, by way of example, indicate that after the determination in 2006, when the rates were sent to TNTech, they implemented commercial and industrial rates soon after, but the residential rates were not changed until 2008. That's almost a year and a half after. So that's why I'm saying there is no time limit for them to implement it. What they can't do is exceed the maximum set by the RIC, but they can use their discretion following on advice from their shareholder about when they should implement the rates for the various categories.
Let me just add a little bit, maybe extend that understanding a bit. So we've been talking largely about 2023 rates because of the methodology we use. That methodology really focuses on the first year, so that would be the rates for 2023. But of course we know that the rates will cover 2023 to 2027. After 2023, TNTech will come back to us, put forward a proposal for rates for 2024, and then they will do that in each successive year. When that happens, the RIC will then evaluate what TNTech is proposing and provide them with the sort of clearance to go forward and to implement those rates.
And just on that point, in that case, 3 months after they make the submission to the RIC, they will be able to, we have to respond. If we don't respond, then in that case, they can then use those rates. So it is in the second year, not the first year, when they make the submission to us, we have 3 months within which we have to respond to them. And if we don't respond, then they can make the adjustment. But of course, we won't do that. We'll ensure that we respond to within 3 months.
I understand that you're making that very clear, Mr. Khan.
Yeah, of course, yes.
Yeah.
You know.
I want the takeaway to be that persons should understand that the rates they're seeing now in 2023 will not necessarily be the same rates over the period 2023 to 2027. The rates can change. TNTech, as we just heard, could approach the RIC to change those rates 2024, 2025, 2026, and 2027. Okay? There's a 3-month window within which the RIC must respond, but TNTech can ask for a change in rates. In the past, there was 1 year where the rates were reduced for the residential customers. It started at 27 cents per kilowatt hour. It went down to 26 cents. So when we say a review, that's what we want people to understand also. It's not necessarily an increase, but it could be reviewed and it could be changed over that period.
Now, I know Mrs. Callendar sitting as the head of the RIC. I know you would have heard people calling into question the independence of the Commission. And so how do you respond to those who question exactly how independently the Commission works?
Yes, so the Commission works very independently in that we are 7 commissioners and we take our duties, I would say, very seriously. And we, as I've said also, we guard our independence of thought very jealously. Now, I got a sense from comments that persons believe that we would work in isolation, and I think that would be unrealistic. This is a small society. We all have relationships outside of what we do with the RIC. We had relationships before we came to the RIC. We also have 3 stakeholders, and 2 of the other stakeholders, besides the members of the public with whom we were interacting recently, TNTech is a stakeholder. We're not going to do our work independently of TNTech. We will engage with them. We expect comments for them. We provided comments for them to them during the course of the public consultation. So we have to get responses to those. We also have to take their needs into account. So we will work with TNTech. The other stakeholder I recognize, we recognize the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Persons have come to the meetings. They've asked for concessions on VAT, for example. The RIC does not have the authority to make those concessions. So again, we have to go back to that stakeholder. So our work is independent, our thought is independent. I have to say that in this role, I would say I've been very fortunate that no one in any position of authority has attempted to influence me or influence the work of the RIC. Yeah. I can say that without fear of contradiction. But it does not mean that we won't hold conversations with persons in positions of authority and persons who have decision-making powers. Yeah.
Well, let's look at another possible stakeholder, Mrs. Callendar. Let's look at WASA. I mean, can we see a review of the water rates sometime in the future?
Well, it does fall under our responsibility. I said that we do service providers and utility service providers, and WASA would fall under that definition. But for us, we just really want to get through the TNTech review at this stage. We want to then debrief ourselves. We want to look at what we've learned before we even jump into WASA or before we even make any commitment or any comment on WASA. If the information should come to us, we would deal with the information. It's our mandate, it's our responsibility. But I would say we want to take all the learnings that we had from this particular exercise and to make that one much more productive.
And final thoughts, Mrs. Callendar.
Well, final thoughts is that I think the public should know that we have listened, we have heard them. During the consultations also, we attempted to provide some information on conservation. We'd asked persons to bring their bills. Some persons did, some persons didn't. We think that service is still useful and persons can still avail themselves of it by calling 800 for RIC and speak to one of our representatives there. I think it would be useful. Also, I think one of the key takeaways for me was the need for some public education, and we will embark on it in a proactive way. We won't only wait to respond to comments, because at times I think we found ourselves in that place, but we want to be proactive. We want to talk to the national community. I think an educated community, an informed community would be the best persons for us to interact with. So we will take up that role and responsibility and go out to the public.
And Mr. Khan, final thoughts?
Yeah, well, we have heard in the public domain that people say that they don't know what is going on. And I think there's an opportune moment to let people know that what we are doing is actually processing all of the comments and responses we receive from the public. It's a very arduous task, and we are engaged in that, and this is why we are not engaging the public. As soon as we are finished with our exercise and we have our final determination, we will then come back to the public to reveal what the final prices are going to look at. In the meantime, allow us the opportunity to get through our work, because that's what we are doing now. We are not idle. We are very busy interrogating all of the responses that we received. And to follow through with the chairman, because of the pandemic, we had not been going out to the public in outreach sessions. That was something we did very regularly before the pandemic. And when this exercise is complete, we will engage that public exercise again with our customer services department and our corporate communications, going to various parts of the country and engaging customers to hear their complaints and to provide them with information about what we do.
So we are in the technology age now, and in addition to the public interface, we have a very active social media presence. I know persons have been following us on Facebook, for example, and on Instagram, and that tool actually proved quite useful as well during the consultations. There were some meetings where we had as many as 500, 600 persons online. So people should continue to follow us there. We had a very effective video as well, informing persons about the guaranteed electricity standards, and many persons didn't know about it before, but we played it throughout the consultations, and Recently, someone called me to say, look, I don't have electricity. I haven't had electricity for about 4 hours. Will I fall under one of your guaranteed standards? Unfortunately, the person did not. I think this, she was referring to guarantee standard number 1, which requires a 10-hour lack of service, and it must be unplanned. So she didn't fall under it, but I think the awareness is increasing, and I think that's a good thing. We will continue to engage the public electronically.
And that's our show. Mr. Khan and Mrs. Callendar, let me thank you so much for joining us on this week's edition of Delving Deeper.
Thank you very much for having us. Yeah.
Join us at the same time next week for another edition of Delving Deeper. I am Kimberly D'Souza, and on behalf of our entire crew, have a good night.